The billionaire walks into his maid's house, and what happens next will shock you. Before we begin the story, please leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. David Cole, a reclusive billionaire in New York City, sat in his luxurious penthouse, gazing out over the skyline. He wasn't like other flashy billionaires. David preferred to remain in the background, never drawing attention to his wealth. Most people saw him as quiet, passive, and not particularly involved in the day-to-day operations of his company. But David's silence hid a sharp mind, one that few ever recognized. Samantha West, his personal assistant, had worked for him for almost 2 years. She was efficient, sharp, and a bit dismissive of David's low-key persona. To her, David was a figurehead, wealthy but uninvolved. He rarely spoke up in meetings, and his decisions were always passed down quietly, never stirring the room. Samantha took charge of the business, believing David's input was secondary. One morning, as Samantha briefed David about a new marketing strategy, she expected the usual passive approval, but instead, David interrupted her calmly, suggesting that they needed control over the data and platform behind the marketing. This was unlike him. He wasn't just nodding along, he was offering a calculated strategy. Samantha was taken aback. She had never heard him speak like this, much less offer a strong opinion. But before she could process it, David finished the conversation, dismissing her with a simple nod. She left his office, questioning everything she thought she knew about him. Later that day, Samantha received a shocking update. David had secretly secured the deal she had just started to negotiate. He hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't even asked for her help. David had bypassed her completely and taken control, securing the company's future in one swift move. David Cole had been underestimated, not only by Samantha but by everyone around him. The quiet billionaire was about to reveal that he was far more than anyone could ever imagine. David leaned back in his office chair, the city skyline sprawling behind him like a scene from a movie. He had always loved the view from this high up, the way everything looked so small and insignificant. In a way, it reminded him of how he felt about the world. Most people viewed him as just another wealthy businessman, but David had learned long ago that it was best to remain unseen. He controlled billions, but in such a subtle way that no one truly understood the magnitude of his influence. Today was no different. Another day of meetings, emails, and quiet power plays from the shadows. At precisely 1 p.m., there was a knock on the door. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Samantha," he said calmly, not bothering to make eye contact. "Yes, Mr. Cole," Samantha replied, stepping into the office with her usual energy, her heels clicking on the polished wood floor. David remained seated, his gaze still focused on the papers in front of him. Samantha began to update him on the latest company progress, but David wasn't really listening. His mind was elsewhere, running through the data from the recent acquisition and the next steps he needed to take. He didn't need Samantha's help on this. He had already handled it. "Mr. Cole, I have the latest market analysis for you," Samantha said, placing the report on his desk. "We're seeing a significant shift in customer behavior. The younger demographic is becoming more tech-savvy, and we should start targeting them more aggressively." David glanced at the report, then back up at her, his eyes sharp but cold. He had already anticipated this. "I've already made arrangements," he replied. "We'll focus on the data ownership and platform control first. You need to push forward on acquiring the necessary rights for that." Samantha froze, the words catching her off guard. She had just started to strategize around the younger demographic and had no idea that David had already made plans to sidestep all her efforts. "But Mr. Cole, she began. But David raised a hand, cutting her off. "Focus on the platform," he said, his tone calm but firm. "That's where the real power lies. Without control of the data, everything else is just noise." Samantha nodded, a tight feeling in her chest. David had always been quiet, but this was the first time she had seen him so assertive. There was a presence in his voice now, one that commanded respect, and she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of confusion. She had always thought of him as passive, someone who let others do the work for him, but today was different. "Of course, Mr. Cole. I'll take care of it," she said, forcing a smile, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to David than she had realized. Later that afternoon, after a long series of meetings, David found himself restless. There were still a dozen things to address, but he couldn't concentrate. He stood up from his desk and walked across the room, the heels of his shoes clicking against the marble floor as he moved toward the balcony. New York City's skyline stretched before him in a dizzying array of glass and steel. For a moment he allowed himself to be lost in the view, but his mind soon returned to Samantha. It was strange, the way she seemed to misunderstand him at every turn. She thought she knew him, but she didn't. No one did. As he stood there, the thoughts of the day swirled in his mind. David had always been content to remain unseen, to let others think he was just another passive businessman. But the truth was, he had been orchestrating things from behind the scenes for years. He had been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to show his true power. Samantha was smart, capable even, but she underestimated him, just like everyone else. She saw only what he allowed her to see. He glanced at the time, 5:00 p.m. Samantha should be finishing up soon. She would likely be on her way to the parking garage soon, ready to leave for the day. But something inside David stirred. He felt the need to confront her, to remind her who was in charge. David decided to leave his office and head toward the elevator, his footsteps steady and purposeful. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, one he couldn't ignore. It was the same feeling he had when he first realized that Samantha had no idea who he really was. He passed by the lobby and headed for the exit, but as he did, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Samantha was standing near the parking garage, her back to him, as she spoke on the phone. She had her arms crossed tightly across her chest, and there was a look on her face that was unfamiliar to him, defensive, almost worried. Her usual composure was gone. David paused, hidden just out of her sight. He couldn't help but overhear part of her conversation. "I don't know. I don't think he knows. No, I haven't said anything, but I'm not sure how long I can keep up this charade." The words hit David like a bolt of lightning. He didn't need to hear any more. He knew exactly what she was talking about. She was playing him, just like everyone else. Without thinking, David stepped forward, his presence suddenly looming over her. "Samantha," he said, his voice cutting through the air. She froze, immediately ending the call and turning to face him. She tried to hide the shock in her eyes, but it was too late. David had already seen through her act. "Mr. Cole, I didn't hear you approach," she stammered, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Clearly," David replied coolly, his gaze unwavering. "Who are you really talking to?" Samantha looked down, avoiding his gaze. "It's nothing, just a personal matter," she said, trying to brush it off. David stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Personal, is it? You think I don't know what's going on?" Samantha felt a knot tighten in her stomach. David was no longer the quiet, passive billionaire she had always thought he was. There was something in his voice now, something that made her realize she had underestimated him just as much as everyone else. "What do you want from me, Mr. Cole?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. David's expression softened, but only slightly. He was in control now, and he knew it. "I want you to understand, Samantha. I'm not the man you think I am." Samantha stood there, completely caught off guard. She had always thought she had him figured out. But now David's words rang in her ears, and for the first time she saw him for what he truly was. A man of power and influence who had been hiding in plain sight. Her mind raced. She had worked for him for 2 years, and in all that time, she never once considered that David might be orchestrating everything behind the scenes. She swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. "What do you want from me?" David's eyes softened, just a fraction. "I want you to understand that I've been watching, Samantha, and I've been playing the game, just like you. But now, it's my turn." Samantha could feel her heart race in her chest. This wasn't the man she had known. This was something else, something far more dangerous. The city below continued its unceasing rhythm as David sat in his office, the hum of the world outside barely reaching him. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. Yet, as beautiful as the view was, David's mind was elsewhere. Samantha's words, her reaction earlier that day, haunted him. Who was she really? He had worked alongside her for almost 2 years, yet in a single moment, he realized he hadn't really seen her. She was more than an assistant. She had her own plans, her own thoughts. And for the first time, David was no longer content to stay in the background. He had always prided himself on his control. Every aspect of his business was carefully planned, measured, calculated. But Samantha's betrayal, the way she had spoken on the phone, the way she had tried to cover it up, had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about her, and his growing, unwanted feelings toward her. "David, get it together," he thought, staring at the documents scattered across his desk. "You've been in control for years. One assistant isn't going to change that," but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Samantha was different. There was something about her, her intelligence, her ambition, her drive, that had always intrigued him. He had pushed those feelings aside, buried them beneath layers of business strategies and power plays. But now, as the weight of the situation settled over him, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Samantha had always considered herself in control of her professional life. She was good at what she did, more than good. She'd worked hard to get where she was. Being David's assistant was more than just a job to her. It was a stepping stone. She had her sights set on something bigger, and she had always believed that, in time, David would simply step aside, letting her take charge. But today had changed everything. The moment she had seen him at the parking garage, standing there with that unblinking stare, she had felt the weight of his scrutiny. David wasn't just another boss. He wasn't just the silent figurehead she had imagined. As she sat at her desk that evening, her mind replayed the conversation in the parking garage over and over again. She had tried to hide her discomfort, but she couldn't shake the feeling that David had seen right through her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from one of the company's investors. She stared at it for a few seconds before deciding to ignore it. She was too distracted to focus on business at the moment. She knew she needed to stay calm, to remain professional. But the more she thought about the day's events, the more she felt a growing unease. Was David toying with her? Or was he finally taking control, showing her what he had been hiding all along? She had always underestimated him, but now she didn't know what to think anymore. The next day, David found himself pacing around his office. It had been a week since the confrontation in the parking garage, and he had tried to keep things normal between him and Samantha. He had avoided discussing the incident, pretending it never happened. But the tension between them was palpable. Every time he saw her, it felt like the air in the room thickened. He couldn't stop thinking about her, her bright eyes, her confidence, the way she held herself. It all made him uneasy, but he couldn't pinpoint why. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years building his empire, his image, his life. Samantha was supposed to be a small part of it, a cog in the machine, not someone who could break through the walls he had so carefully constructed. But every time she entered the room, his thoughts scattered. He couldn't help but notice the way her voice lingered in the air, the way her presence filled the space. And now, that simple interaction in the parking garage felt like a turning point, a line crossed, one that he wasn't sure how to erase. That afternoon, Samantha walked into David's office, a stack of reports in hand. As usual, her posture was perfect, her demeanor professional. She placed the reports on his desk, but David barely looked at them. His eyes were fixed on her, his gaze sharp. Samantha felt the weight of his stare and shifted uncomfortably. "I brought you the quarterly projections, Mr. Cole," she said, trying to sound confident, even though she felt exposed. David didn't speak right away. He simply observed her, his eyes never leaving her face. What did he want from her? She could feel his gaze, like it was peeling away her defenses, making her feel vulnerable. It was almost as if he could see right into her thoughts. "You're very efficient, Samantha," David finally said, his voice steady. "But I think you're still missing something." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" David leaned forward, folding his arms across his chest. "You're focused on the wrong things. You think the company's success depends on numbers and projections, but you've never taken the time to understand the foundation of it all." Samantha frowned, confusion written on her face. What foundation? David's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not just about the business, Samantha. It's about the people. The ones who pull the strings, control the flow of information. That's where the real power lies." Samantha swallowed, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A challenge? "And where do you fit into all this, Mr. Cole?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "Are you telling me you've been controlling everything all along?" David didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, gazing out at the city. He didn't need to say it aloud. The message was clear. "You'll learn," he finally said, his back to her. "The game isn't what you think it is, Samantha. You've underestimated me, and it's time you realized why." Samantha stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. He was playing a game with her, one that she wasn't sure she was prepared for. But she wasn't going to back down. "I'll be sure to remember that," she said, her voice steady, though her hands clenched at her sides. David turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I hope you do. Because in this world, underestimating the wrong person is the fastest way to lose everything." Samantha left David's office that afternoon with a heavy heart. Her mind was reeling from the confrontation. She had always thought she was in control, that she understood the way things worked at the company. But now, she wasn't so sure. David had always been quiet, passive, seemingly uninterested in the day-to-day grind. But after that conversation, she began to wonder if she had been wrong all along. Had he been playing the long game this whole time? She thought about the deal he had secured, the way he had bypassed her entirely. And then there was the conversation in the parking garage. David wasn't just a passive businessman, quietly observing. He was much more than that, and it scared her. As the evening drew on, Samantha found herself in her apartment, sitting on the couch with her phone in her hands, but not really looking at it. Her thoughts kept circling back to David, to his words, to the way he had made her feel small, exposed. For the first time since she had started working for him, she realized just how much she had misjudged him. And more than that, she realized something else. David Cole had power, in ways she hadn't even imagined. And that power was now very much in play. David had never been one to rush into decisions. Every move he made was calculated, every word measured. It was how he had built his empire, by staying in the background, making everyone think he was simply a quiet, passive figure, while in reality, he was orchestrating every significant move from behind the scenes. And now, it was time to let his power show. That afternoon, as he sat in his office looking over company reports, a sudden idea struck him. He had been holding back for too long. It was time to show Samantha the full extent of his control. For months, she had underestimated him. She thought she had him figured out, thought that his silence and passivity meant weakness. But now, David was about to make sure she understood just how wrong she was. Samantha had always been ambitious, constantly working hard to climb the corporate ladder. She was intelligent, capable, but too eager to assume that her way was the best way. It wasn't her fault, not entirely. Everyone else had made the same mistake. No one ever considered David a threat, even as he built and expanded his influence in subtle ways. But David knew the truth. He didn't need to be loud. He didn't need to take up space. He didn't need to fight for attention. The attention would come to him when the time was right. Today was that time. David stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the sprawling city below. He had played the quiet game for long enough. He had allowed Samantha and everyone else to believe he was merely an observer. But now, he was ready to take control. The world would soon know who David Cole really was. Samantha had been feeling a strange unease for the past few days. Ever since that conversation with David in the parking garage, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. David wasn't the man she thought he was. She had always seen him as passive, someone who just signed papers and made decisions from behind a desk. But now, she was beginning to see the cracks in the facade. The more she thought about it, the more it all seemed so obvious. David had been controlling everything all along, and she had never even realized it. She had been focused on the wrong things, on the projects, on the marketing strategies, on the surface-level issues. While David had been playing a far more intricate game beneath the surface, Samantha had always been the one in control of the details. She made sure the schedules were set, the clients were satisfied, the team was performing. But now, she couldn't help but feel that she was being swept along by forces she didn't fully understand. Every time she thought she had David figured out, he slipped away from her grasp, leaving her with more questions than answers. As she sat at her desk that afternoon, preparing a report for the next board meeting, her mind kept drifting back to the conversation with David. He had said things she hadn't been able to process at the time, things that now felt like clues she had missed. What did he mean when he said, "You'll learn"? What did he mean when he said, "The game isn't what you think it is"? And most importantly, why did she feel like he had been 2 steps ahead of her all this time? Samantha's phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a reminder for an upcoming meeting with the investors. She sighed and looked at the clock. She had 5 minutes before she needed to be in the conference room. But even as she prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to change. And when it did, she wasn't sure if she would be ready for it. David had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He had already anticipated the steps Samantha would take to challenge his decisions. She had been vocal about wanting more responsibility, about taking charge of bigger projects, about proving herself. But she hadn't realized that in her quest for power, she had overlooked the most important detail. David was already the one pulling the strings. His hand hovered over his desk phone. He had already set everything in motion. The board meeting was scheduled for later that afternoon, and David had requested a special presentation to be given by one of the key figures in the company. But it wouldn't be just any presentation. This one would reveal David's true hand, a hand that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The time had come for Samantha to see exactly what David was capable of when he decided to show his power. David picked up the phone and dialed the number for the CEO of a major competitor, a rival he had been subtly influencing for months. When the call was answered, David spoke with his usual calmness. "Good afternoon, Mark," David said smoothly. "I trust everything is in order for the meeting later today." Yes, I know we've been quiet, but today we'll make it clear who has the upper hand." He paused, listening to the response on the other end, and then added, "I expect nothing less than full cooperation from your team. We wouldn't want things to get complicated." David hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, the satisfaction of the plan unfolding slowly settling in. He knew that once Samantha saw what he was capable of, there would be no turning back. She would understand the game then, and the game David knew was his to win. As the hour approached for the board meeting, David stood in front of the large conference room, waiting for Samantha and the rest of the team to arrive. He knew the dynamics of these meetings all too well, how everyone would talk over one another, how each person would try to assert their own agenda. But today was different. Today, David wasn't going to sit back and let the meeting unfold as usual. Samantha entered the room first, her eyes immediately scanning the table for the familiar faces of the board members. She sat down, adjusting her notes, but David could see the uncertainty in her posture. She was beginning to realize something wasn't right. She didn't know exactly what yet, but she felt it in the air. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries. Reports were presented and plans were discussed, but David barely paid attention. He was watching Samantha, reading her reactions. The tension between them was palpable. She was growing increasingly uncomfortable, and David could feel the pull of her confusion, her curiosity, her need to understand what was happening. Then, at just the right moment, David stood up. "I think we've covered enough of the surface issues," David said, his voice commanding immediate attention. "Now let's get to the real matter at hand." He motioned to the screen behind him, where a detailed presentation began to unfold. It was a project David had secretly been working on for months, an acquisition that would double the company's value overnight. He had already secured the rights to a new technology platform that would revolutionize the market. Samantha's jaw dropped as she saw the figures on the screen. This wasn't just an ordinary deal. This was a game changer. And yet David had managed to keep it hidden from everyone, including her. She had been working in the dark, oblivious to the true scope of what David had been doing. "This is what I've been working on," David continued, his gaze sweeping over the room. "I've already secured the acquisition. The board has already been informed. I simply wanted to make sure you all understood why I didn't share this earlier. The time wasn't right. But now, it is." Samantha looked at him, her mind reeling. She had never felt more exposed. All this time, she had thought David was just another businessman, silently watching the world unfold. But now, she realized that David had been the one shaping the world, quietly moving the pieces on the board without anyone noticing. As the realization hit her, David met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You were right, Samantha," he said softly. "The game isn't what you think it is." The meeting had ended with a silence that felt heavier than any words could convey. Samantha stood at the back of the conference room, her mind spinning, struggling to reconcile everything she had just learned. The presentation David had revealed, his hidden acquisition, the future of the company, his sudden shift from the quiet observer to the mastermind, had shattered her perception of him. David had played her, and he had done it with such subtlety that she hadn't even realized it until now. She had underestimated him in ways she hadn't even considered. She thought she was playing the game, but David had been playing her all along. As the board members filed out of the room, their excited chatter about the acquisition and new projects filled the air, but Samantha couldn't focus on any of it. She felt like she was in a fog, a mixture of anger, confusion, and, dare she admit it, admiration. David Cole was no longer just her boss. He was something much more dangerous, and now she couldn't decide whether to be angry with him or terrified of him. Samantha stepped into the hallway, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She needed to call someone. She needed to process this, to figure out what her next move should be. But as the phone rang, she realized there was only one person she could talk to about this, her own reflection. She didn't know who she was anymore. She had built her career on ambition and control, but now she was facing the truth. David had always been a step ahead. And worse, he had let her think he was just a passive player, letting her make her own moves while he quietly orchestrated everything in the background. Samantha felt her frustration boil over. She had to confront him. She had to face him and demand answers. She couldn't let him continue to manipulate her. Not anymore. But as the elevator doors opened, Samantha hesitated. She had been so sure of herself before, certain that she was playing a role in a larger game. But now, the weight of the situation was too much to ignore. Was she ready to face David on his terms? The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to the penthouse floor. Samantha stepped out, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She would finally get the answers she needed. David was already in his office when Samantha arrived. He was standing by the window, his back to her, as usual. The city sprawled beneath him like a chessboard, with all the pieces in motion. He had set his plan in motion, and now all that was left was to watch it unfold. But as Samantha stepped inside, David felt a shift in the air, a tension he hadn't expected. He knew she would come. He had been waiting for it. The confrontation was inevitable. After all, Samantha wasn't the type to back down. She was ambitious, driven, and now she had just been shown the extent of his power. David couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, though he would never let that show. Samantha stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had spent the past few minutes trying to calm herself, trying to figure out how to approach David. But now that she was here, all of her plans felt inadequate. She had been ready for this, but now the weight of the situation was crashing down on her. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice tight with frustration. David turned slowly, meeting her gaze. The look in his eyes was cool, almost detached. But there was something else there, too. A quiet power, a sense of certainty that made Samantha feel like a novice in a game she didn't understand. "Miss West," he replied evenly. "I assume you have questions." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "Questions? You think this is just about questions?" she demanded, stepping forward. "You've been playing everyone this whole time. The board, me, all of us, like pawns on a chessboard." David's gaze flickered, but he didn't react. He had expected her to be angry, but the intensity of her frustration surprised him. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether it was anger or something else that was driving her. "You've underestimated me, Samantha," David said quietly. "But now you understand. Now you see why I kept things the way I did." Samantha shook her head, her hands clenched at her sides. "I don't understand anything. You manipulated all of us. You had the power all along, and you just sat back and let us think we were in charge." David stepped toward her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't need to take the spotlight. The world is full of people fighting for attention, but I don't need to compete for it. My power doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being in control. You should have learned that by now." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Control. That was the key. That was what he had been doing all along. And now, standing in front of him, she realized just how much she had missed. "You want me to admire you for that?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and something deeper. "You think this was all some game to prove you were better than everyone?" David shook his head, his eyes softening. "No, Samantha. It's not about being better than anyone. It's about understanding that power isn't always about making noise. It's about knowing when to stay silent and knowing when to make the right move." Samantha felt the anger rising again, but she couldn't deny it. David was right. She had been too eager to prove herself, too eager to take charge without seeing the bigger picture. He had played her, and she had walked right into it. But that didn't mean she was going to let him have the last word. Samantha took a deep breath, her eyes flashing with determination. "I don't care how many moves you've made, David. You won this round, but I'm not backing down. You've shown your hand, but you haven't won the game yet." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her sudden shift in demeanor. For the first time since their conversation started, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of respect. "You think you can beat me?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Samantha squared her shoulders. I don't need to beat you. I just need to play the game on my own terms now." David chuckled softly, the sound carrying a hint of both amusement and something else, something far more dangerous. "You're not ready for that," he said, his tone still even, though there was a flicker of something darker beneath the surface. "The game you think you're playing is one I've already mastered." But Samantha didn't back down. "Maybe, but I'm not playing by your rules anymore." For a moment they stood there in silence, each of them staring the other down. It was a battle of wills now, and neither of them was willing to blink first. Samantha turned to leave, but as she reached the door, David called after her. "Samantha," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm, "this game is far from over, and when you're ready to truly understand how to play, you'll come back. But until then, you'll be just another pawn in the game." Samantha paused, her hand on the door handle. She didn't turn around, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "We'll see about that, mister." "Cole," she said, "I'm not done yet." And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving David standing alone, watching her go. Samantha couldn't focus on her work the next day. Every time she tried to concentrate, her mind wandered back to the previous night's confrontation with David. She replayed their conversation in her mind over and over again, the weight of his words lingering in her thoughts. "The game isn't what you think it is," he had said. "You've underestimated me." The sting of his words hurt, but what truly unsettled her was the realization that he was right. She had underestimated him in every way. David wasn't just a passive billionaire. He was a master manipulator, quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes. And now, as much as she hated to admit it, she was in deep. Samantha had been playing a game where she thought she had the upper hand, but David had already moved the pieces, long before she had even realized it. She had thought she could beat him, but now she wasn't so sure. As she sat at her desk, trying to make sense of her emotions, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from David. "Meet me in my office at 5 p.m. We need to talk." The message sent a chill down her spine. Talk? What could he possibly want now? She had made it clear that she wasn't going to back down, but she also knew that David wasn't someone who gave up easily. She glanced at the clock. There were still several hours before the meeting. She couldn't stop herself from thinking about what might happen when she finally came face to face with him again. There was a knot in her stomach, a mix of frustration and curiosity. She wanted answers. She wanted to know how far David had planned everything, how much of it was part of his intricate strategy. And more than anything, she wanted to understand what this was between them. Samantha had always prided herself on being in control. But now, after everything that had happened, she couldn't help but feel as though she had lost that control. It was as if David had turned the tables, and she was scrambling to catch up. David sat in his office, his hands folded in front of him, staring out at the city below. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and now it was almost here. Samantha was coming to him. She would come to understand that the power dynamics between them had changed. David's mind wasn't focused on business for once. He had always been in control, but now the game had taken a more personal turn. Samantha was more than just his assistant now. She had become an obstacle, someone who had challenged his carefully constructed world, and for that, he needed to address her. He had played the long game, hidden his cards, and manipulated everyone around him, including her. But now he could feel it. She wasn't going to be an easy opponent. Samantha was smart, driven, and her anger wasn't something to take lightly. She was dangerous in her own way. Still, David had no doubts about the outcome. He had always known that power was about control, and now that he had it, he wasn't going to let go. The sound of the elevator door opening broke his thoughts. Samantha had arrived. Samantha walked into David's office at precisely 5 p.m., her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had tried to prepare herself for whatever David was going to say, But now that she was standing in front of him, it was clear that she was still uncertain. David didn't speak right away. He remained seated behind his desk, his eyes cold, his face unreadable. There was no warmth, no apology, only a quiet power that seemed to fill the room. Samantha stood still for a moment, her gaze meeting his. She had never been this nervous in front of him before. What did he want? Was this another round of manipulation? Was he going to continue to try and control her? "I'm here," she said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of hesitation in it. David didn't respond immediately. He simply motioned to the chair across from him, silently inviting her to sit. When she did, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You came," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were testing her. Samantha crossed her arms defensively. "I'm not here to play games, David. I've made it clear that I won't just follow your lead anymore." David nodded slowly. "I never expected you to. You're not the type of person who follows anyone, are you?" Samantha flinched at his words. Was that his game now? To undermine her at every turn? But she refused to let him see how much it stung. "I'm here because I need to know what's going on," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "What is this really about, David? Why all the secrecy? Why play this game with me?" "With everyone?" David leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand unless I showed you," he replied, his voice calm, measured. "You don't get it, Samantha. Power isn't something you can control. It's something you learn to wield. And you—" "I don't need a lesson in power," she interrupted, unable to keep the edge from her voice. David smiled faintly. "No, you don't. But you need to understand what's at stake. This isn't about you and me. It's about control over everything. Everything you thought was in your hands. Now, you see, it's mine." Samantha felt a spark of anger flare inside her. He had already taken so much, but now he was pushing her. He wasn't just playing a game. He was trying to take everything she had worked for. "That's where you're wrong, David," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not just about control. It's about how you treat people. And you—" She swallowed hard. "You treat everyone like pawns in your game. I won't be a pawn. I won't let you have that power over me." David's expression shifted slightly, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "You're already a part of the game, Samantha. You always have been." David rose from his chair and walked toward the window, his back still to her. He stared out at the city, his thoughts far away. He had played this game for a long time, and he had always known that there would come a time when Samantha would realize the truth. He turned back to her, his face hardening. "Do you think I did all this just to prove a point? Do you think I manipulated everyone, including you, because I wanted to feel superior?" Samantha's breath caught. Was that really what he thought? She had thought that he was only about control, but now she was starting to realize that there was more to it. "Then why, David?" she asked, her voice small. "Why go through all of this?" David stepped closer to her, his presence overpowering. "Because I wanted you to see that the world isn't what you think it is. Power doesn't come from being in charge. It comes from knowing the right moves to make, at the right time." Samantha stared at him, her eyes searching his face. She didn't know what she expected, but the truth was something she hadn't anticipated. David had been playing a game all along, but it wasn't about proving who was better. It was about proving something deeper, something about control, and about recognizing who was truly in charge. But David wasn't finished. His gaze softened, just for a moment, as he spoke the words that would change everything. "I wanted you to understand, Samantha. You were never a pawn. You were a player, but you can't play a game until you know the rules." Samantha stood, her heart racing. She had learned more in the past few hours than she ever thought possible. David had manipulated her, yes. He had played a game, but there was something more here. Something she hadn't fully understood until now. He wanted her to see it. He wanted her to realize that she was part of the game, but not just any part. She was a key player, but that didn't mean she had to accept the rules he set out. She had a choice to make. "I understand now," Samantha said, her voice steady. "But this ends here, David. I won't play by your rules anymore. Not if it means losing myself in the process." David's face remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of respect, perhaps. "We'll see, Samantha," he said, his voice low and calm. "We'll see if you can survive without the game." With that, he turned back to the window, the conversation over. Samantha took a deep breath. The reckoning had come. She had made her choice. Now it was time to play the game on her terms. The next few days were a blur of emotions for both Samantha and David. The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them was willing to acknowledge it directly. They went about their daily tasks, meetings, calls, reports, as though everything were normal, but both knew that things were anything but normal. Samantha had made her decision. She was no longer going to let David control her life. She had spent too long playing by his rules, underestimating the impact of his actions on her career, and ignoring the deeper motivations behind his moves. She knew now that David wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to break her. And she wouldn't let him. David, on the other hand, knew that the game between them had shifted. He had seen the way Samantha had grown, how she was no longer the eager assistant who followed every instruction without question. She had become a threat, a competitor, and David couldn't afford to underestimate her any longer. But despite the increasing tension, neither of them was willing to make the first move. David had always controlled the flow of information, the decisions, the timing. But now, he was waiting for Samantha's response. He knew that she was a player now, and he had no idea how far she would go to take control. The turning point came when Samantha received a call from an unexpected source. Mark, the CEO of the competing tech company David had been influencing for months, had reached out to her directly. "We need to talk," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with urgency. "David has made a move that we're not prepared for. I think you should know what's coming." Samantha's heart raced as she listened. Mark outlined how David had secretly been negotiating deals with other companies, not just to expand his own reach, but to eliminate competitors entirely. He was playing a much larger game, one that Samantha hadn't fully understood until now. "This isn't just about business, Samantha," Mark said. "This is about power, and David is going to do whatever it takes to hold on to it." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. David had been manipulating the entire industry for years, pulling strings in ways she couldn't even begin to fathom. This wasn't just about them, it was about something much bigger, something David had been hiding for a long time. She hung up the phone, her mind spinning. She needed answers. She needed to confront him, once and for all. This game was no longer just about their personal rivalry. It was about the fate of everything they had worked for. David had made his move, and now it was time for Samantha to make hers. Later that afternoon, Samantha walked into David's office, her mind sharp and focused. She had spent the last few hours preparing herself for this moment, gathering all the information she had about David's covert dealings. She had no illusions anymore. She knew exactly what he was capable of. David was sitting behind his desk, as usual, his expression calm and unreadable. But this time, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor when she entered. He didn't smile or greet her. He simply watched her walk in, as though he had been expecting her. Samantha closed the door behind her, her eyes never leaving his. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken tension. "I know what you've been doing, David," Samantha said, her voice steady but firm. David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "I'm sure you do," he said, his voice calm, almost as if this conversation were nothing new. "You think I don't see through your games?" Samantha continued, her eyes narrowing. "You've been playing everyone, Mark, the board, me. And for what? To prove you can control everything? To dominate?" David's expression softened slightly, but there was no trace of apology in his eyes. "I didn't need to prove anything. I've been controlling things for a long time, Samantha. The difference is that you're starting to understand that now." Samantha took a step closer, her voice growing more intense. "I'm done being a part of your game. I've worked hard for everything I've achieved, but I'm not going to keep playing by your rules anymore." David's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. A trace of respect, maybe, or something deeper. "You never understood, did you?" he said, his voice low. "This was never about control. It was about understanding the bigger picture. You're right. I've been playing a game, but I never had any intention of hurting you, Samantha. I wanted you to see how the world really works." Samantha took a deep breath, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about their rivalry. It was about power, influence, and the delicate balance between them. David had always been in control, but now he was acknowledging that Samantha had risen to his level. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She was a force in her own right. "I see it now," she said quietly, her gaze steady. "And that's why I'm going to take control of this myself. You've had your turn, David, but it's my turn now." David looked at her, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the change in his posture. Samantha was no longer the pawn. She had become the queen. "I'm not going to stop until I see this through," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'll take the company, the board, everything you've built. And I'll do it my way." David stood, his face a mask of calm. "We'll see about that, Samantha," he said, his tone colder now. "But understand this, you won't be able to do it without me. You might think you have control now, but power isn't something you can just take. It's something you earn, and you haven't earned it yet." Samantha's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. She knew this wasn't just a battle for control, it was a battle for their future, but she was no longer afraid. "I'll earn it, David," she said, her voice steady. "And I'll show you that I don't need your game to win." David gave her one last long look, and then, without another word, he turned and walked to the window, his back to her. The days that followed the confrontation were tense. Samantha moved quickly, asserting her authority in the company. She worked tirelessly to secure deals, negotiate with the board, and position herself as the new leader of the company. But David's shadow loomed over her every step, a constant reminder of the man who had orchestrated everything for so long. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Samantha doubted herself, when the weight of the situation felt too much to bear. But each time she faced a challenge, she reminded herself why she was doing this, to prove that she could play the game on her own terms. Meanwhile, David watched from the sidelines, his eyes constantly on Samantha. He had underestimated her. He had never believed she could take control, but now he was beginning to see that she was a force to be reckoned with. Finally, after weeks of intense competition and strategic moves, the moment came when Samantha stood before the board and presented her vision for the future of the company. The room was silent as she spoke, her words clear, concise, and full of conviction. When she finished, there was a pause. The board members exchanged looks, and then, slowly, they began to nod. Samantha had won. David stood at the back of the room, watching the scene unfold. He had played the game. But now, it was over. Samantha had taken control, and in the end she had earned it. As the dust settled, Samantha stood at the head of the boardroom, her vision now a reality. She had proven herself. The power she once struggled to grasp was now in her hands. David had played his game, but in the end, it was Samantha who outplayed him. David, from his corner of the room, watched in silence. His empire was no longer the fortress it once was. Samantha had shown him that true power wasn't just about control. It was about understanding the game and adapting. And she had done just that. In the end, she had earned her place at the top. As the board members congratulated her, Samantha's thoughts lingered on everything she had been through. She had fought for every inch of ground. She had faced the silent manipulations of someone who seemed unbeatable. But now she was in control, and she had the respect she had always wanted. And for the first time she could breathe easy. The game had ended, and she was the winner. What do you think? Was Samantha's victory well earned? Did David deserve to lose control? Or was there a better way he could have played the game? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on more incredible stories like this. And if you think this story deserves a rating of 1 to 10, leave a comment with your rating. I'd love to know how you felt about it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.